Could we, there's several empty slides. Okay. One of the things about the new urbanism is that there are different phases. You know, there are different phases of it. And we're very old now. And one of the things that has happened to the new urbanists now is that the young people are now the old people, and the old people are often very powerful. Some new urbanists are in the highest positions in Washington. Some of them have the ear of rulers. Their whole nations. Kuwait has a smart code as the first national code. Cuba essentially has a smart code as its model code, and it is the code that's actually activated in Havana. You can pick up the phone and say you're a new urbanist and probably get your call answered in Washington. We're all grown up. But there was a time when we weren't. And it's very important, I think, to know at what level you're discussing. But I have brought this slide and made it, which used to be my last slide, and now it's the most prominent slide, and it has to do with nature and culture. And the agenda of the new urbanism of the 21st century is entirely to be powered by the environmental movement. The funny thing is that we used to think in the early days that we had to be powered by the market. That you know, if we just focus on the developers, the people who actually built America, and we didn't alienate them, and we developed the ability to get permits where no one else could. We would go in, and there'd be dead projects that were single use, you know, the mall that never got permitted, the housing subdivision with cul-de-sacs nobody wanted, and the new urbanists would come in and say, we can get a permit here because we're mixed use, and people say, oh yes, that's what we want. And as long as we made certain that we didn't have extraneous agendas, and there's a lot of reform that's necessary in America, but as long as we connected it to the middle class and did buildings that they liked so that developers could sell the buildings, we connected to the power base, which was essentially the American middle class. Okay, this is very different from other power bases, which are the poor that need to be housed and the elite that need to be amused. And those are well in hand by the avant-garde architects who do the high art stuff, and of course government who does the middle. So we used to connect to the power base of the middle class. We were very market oriented, you know. And then it turns out that the power for the 21st century isn't the market, it's the environmental movement. And there are hundreds, if not thousands, of environmental organizations, and they have taken up, they're the ethical proposition. Now, I said hundreds, and I mean it. There are very, very few urban organizations like the New Urbanism that care about the humans. You know, for example, if you see the overlay of organizations in Florida that are concerned about hydrology, keeping water clean, it's probably, there are 7 organizations, actually counting the feds all the way down. Every time you do water in Florida, you have to check with 7 levels of government, including local. And who's taking care of the humans? Nobody. Well, there's a school board that says we need to have schools, and you know, people that more or less, you know, but basically, whatever attempt we had to have an organization to take care of the humans has been dismantled. Okay, so there's a lot of environmental organizations raring to go, and too many of them are protecting ever more exotic and rare species. Too many of them are taking care of exactly the same agenda of hydrology. The agenda for the new urbanism, the 21st century, is to get the environmental sensibility to actually become expert in administering the city. So I would say that the agenda of the new urbanism for the 21st century is actually a conditional surrender of the city to the environmental movements. Okay, not an unconditional surrender. An unconditional surrender would require the greening of the cities with urban woodland, with trout streams everywhere, with the daylighting of streams. That would be the unconditional surrender of basically the people who are protecting nature coming in and naturalizing the city. Okay, that's already happening, and that's not the agenda. The conditional surrender would be to say, no urban boundary has ever held. they may have held for 10 or 20 years. Even the Portland one didn't do that. And if anything that holds for only 20 years is irrelevant in the scheme of things. An urban boundary, we're talking about centuries here. An urban boundary that holds for 20 years is no good. What needs to be administered is the creation of cities so lovely that people don't want to leave them. So the way to establish an urban boundary is not to draw a line here and say, here you stop, because it'll keep moving out. The asymmetry of value is too high. You know, when you see that urban boundary, this land inside can't be worth 100 times more than the land outside. That'll break. The only way to save nature, to safeguard nature, is to make places that humans love. And insofar as environmentalists can understand that the second half of the toolbox is the urban one, and we can empower the environmental movements to be able to assess cities like we do, you know, this is what humans love. If you make a city like Charleston, if you make a city like Portland, if you make a city like San Francisco, they don't want to leave. Only the losers leave. As opposed to what happens now, in which the winners are the ones who want to live in nature. And so I would say that that's the agenda, to connect to the environmental movement. Next. Okay, next. And what they need to understand is that America will continue to be built by developers. Okay, these are not the bad guys. In fact, virtually everything that we love is built by developers. This hotel was built by a developer. You know, Savannah was built by developers. Charleston was built by developers. It's not the developer per se or the development system. It's the pattern that the developer does. For example, this is Coral Gables. Charlotte. This is Charlotte, a place that now is against development, believe it or not, because it's so unsustainable. Even Charlotte, the great success of the South. And this is George Merrick, the founder of my town, Coral Gables, which is a lovely place everybody loves, has very high real estate value. He was a developer, but what he had in mind was a walkable mixed-use town. And insofar as developers do walkable mixed-use town, they're an essential tool of what we do. So we need to rehabilitate the developer per se, instead of demonizing the developer. Next. And that's why we call them town founders. Now, the other thing that needs to happen, and in some ways this is going backwards, is that CM, by the way, when you think about the modernist CM, we think of the high rises of Le Corbusier, you know, the beautiful, very often beautiful architecture. But the end result of the 5 zones that Le Corbusier came up with actually degenerated into housing subdivisions where we only live, that are monocultures of income, shopping centers where you only shop, nobody lives or works there. Next. Office parks where you work, and then the civic institutions, in this case a high school. Look at the kids and the cars they need in Florida just to be a viable teenager. You basically are not socially viable without a car. Imagine the expense of that. And actually the frustration as a child or as a teenager when you can't even get a date because your father can't afford a car, because your kid can't afford a car. So this is actually where CM went to die, where modernism went to die. And this is not understood by the architecture schools. They still think that it's all so heroic, you know, that it's actually a matter of aesthetics, when in fact the urbanism isn't about the beauty of speed and the beautiful highways and having enough green. The problem is, you must always control this. When you actually go into quantity, how does your idea degenerate? Remember that mediocrity is like gravity. Okay, whatever you launch actually falls into mediocrity. Okay, it lands. And so you have to control, what is it that I'm going to put out there so that it actually, even when it becomes mediocre, it's acceptable. And what happened to CM and the five daily zones is it ended up like this. It was totally uncontrolled mediocrity. And by the way, the highways, this is the V7 of Le Corbusier. V7, V6, you know, he invented the system. Next. Okay, now, one of the things that is so important about the marketing is that it's completely rational, and there isn't a single market. And virtually everybody has different stages in life that need different things, and you could actually see this traced very easily in a town like this. This is a typical American town, happens to be in New Hampshire, but it could be in Texas. You can recognize what you're like. And what you have here is you have the center of town with shops, and above the shops is housing, and the housing is inexpensive because it's above the shop, which isn't necessarily desirable because of noise and et cetera. You don't have your own parking space. But also, the people who are young, who actually want to live there, actually like the nightlife, because the nightlife extends actually the time where they can actually meet and sample genetic material, which is actually their job. When you're young, the job is to see like who's available for mating. And when you succeed in mating and having offspring, you move out what we call the transect and move into the middle, the so-called middle zone, or the middle, what's the name of they call it, there's a name for it at Harvard, the sort of middle geography, which is a house or a townhouse that has a yard where actually the kid presumably plays, or the dog presumably plays, but you can still walk to the town center. And while a lot of the new urbanist communities are made out of houses, it's amazing how a kid at 6 or 7 has a complete independent life. There are 7-year-old children in Kentlands that mom says, here's $5, see you at dinner, right? And because the streets are walkable, and their friends are brought in from the other subdivisions into Kentlands, because it's the only walkable ones. You don't have to take the kid to see their friends. Their friends come to Kentlands, and they walk around, and they negotiate their grilled cheese sandwich, et cetera. They have a great life, and they come back at dinner. And by the way, they're highly supervised, which is not so good when you're older. But you always know, hey, your kid has gone down the street. And this is a very big place, Kentlands, with high schools and so forth. But the kids can actually walk in. And then, don't forget that the system, we work very, very hard in America, and the reward system, believe it or not, is not spiritual, it's owning stuff. We work very hard because we get credit to own stuff before we actually paid for it. And so if you play your cards right, you get to own stuff. You get to own a bigger house, you get to own a bigger lot, you get to own a bigger garage in which you can store your kayak and the stuff. If you cut across the stuff, you cut across the American reward system, and you basically stop working a little too soon. The whole society collapses. When that happens, you move to the edge of town where you can have more stuff, more yard, the tractor that cuts it, etc. And then at some point, and there you've made the American dream. Satisfactory or not, you're probably still in spiritual crisis, but you have owned these things. Now at some point you say, you stop actually going out at night, and you stop going out in winter, because I'm already there. I don't like to drive that much at night. Okay, I'm not a teenager when the cars were marvelous things. Let's not go visit the friend. And eventually you can't drive at all. And so what we do is we take the old people, what we used to do, take the old people, sell the house, clear it up for the next generation, and then the old folks would come downtown, where you could always see these apartment buildings downtown, these elegant old apartment buildings. In every single downtown in America, there was the elegant apartment building where the people from the downtown came in, lived in apartments, and walk around to their daily needs. There was an ebb and flow of life that was supremely intelligent, and it coincided with preference. Not only could you prefer to live in the city and prefer to live in the country, but guess what? You could have both. You could actually have both. You could actually have a country life and walk into the city or bike into the city. By the way, when you have a contiguous urban fabric like in Miami, and which is, I think, the misbegotten ideal of having a continuous fabric and having nature, it takes me 45 minutes to drive to nature in Miami. That's not the new urbanist model. The new urbanist model, I would posit, is actually a series of whole towns that are actually interspersed so that people can both walk to nature and walk to the town center. Okay, and I know that we have maniacs that just want contiguous urban fabric because it lengthens the car trips and it makes transit more important. But if you really think about what people want, they want both. They want a primary residence in one or the other, but they want to get to the other. I want to live in the country and get to the town, or I want to get to the town. Or I want to live in town, but every once in a while I want to bicycle to the country. That's the ideal, and it's market-oriented. And so you come in, and the whole ebb and flow of life works along the transect. And the transect is actually the discipline that allows you to even discuss what it is that you are designing. So the answer of, do we want, and this is typical, do you want dark sky? Right now, there's organizations that think that the sky should be dark because it disorients the birds. That's not the answer. There's no single answer in the new urbanism, because you have in a meeting like this and somebody says, oh, I want dark sky. They've read somewhere that dark sky is the solution, and they're bumper sticker people. If we have dark sky, all will be well with the world. Bless them. But then over here, there's another parent that says, all our children are leaving. They're going to Chicago. What's up? We're dying. And I said, that's because you haven't got a nightlife. So here you have people that want a dark sky and people who need a nightlife. So the answer is both. You need a place that's lit like daylight, you know, so that the kids don't have to go to Chicago, so they can actually have their nightlife and find their mates and do whatever they do at night. And also there are people who prefer the other. So there isn't a single answer for lighting. There's a whole declension of answers. And the same thing goes with bicycles. Right now there's a crisis. Everybody wants a bike lane. The bike lane destroys parking, which then destroys the retail. No, there isn't a single answer. There are bike trails, bike lanes, and bike routes. It's all three, and they correspond to different elements in the transect. And one of the things that some of us are doing in the new urbanism is actually saying there is no single answer. You know, because these single propositions are very, very attractive. And some of us are saying, actually, we need the full declension. So yes, we do need fast roads, but we also need small roads. Yes, we need the big fire engines, but we need the small fire engines. And it's always about enriching. So it's quite interesting, the fight. Now, if you think that you're going to stand up here as an American planner and be moralistic and tell people, you're wrong, you, madam, are wrong, you, sir, are wrong, forget about it. Because not only will the wrong person hate you viscerally, but everybody else will turn on you and think you're being oppressive. Okay, you cannot say, you can say, you're all right. Let's just allocate your preference. There will be a place for you, and a place for you, and a place for you, and a place for you, a place for everybody. And we will assemble this in a way that is symbiotic. We will make a place where the dark sky and the size of the lot and the composting and the solar panels actually reinforce each other. And there'll be another place where the bright lights and the density and the transit doesn't need to be subsidized, and you can forget about the solar panels because there's not enough roof, you know, and the markets will be small, but over there the markets will be large. And what I have found, it took me a while to get there, is that actually you never have to say no, you just have to say where. And the other thing that is remarkable, and this is something that came up, at the beginning, no one believed that people wanted to live in such places. And there was a fellow called Tony Nelson who invented something called the visual preference study. And he would put together 2 slides of 2 ways to live. House with a porch, house without a porch, you know, this, that, you know, a main street with shops, a shopping center there. He would put them up, and he would have a scientific method, pre-computer, in which people would rate things. They prefer this, they prefer that. And then he would show it at the end, and he would show the good thing and the bad thing. And he would say, can you believe that 60% of the people want this? In other words, the good stuff was always more popular. And he would get all worked up and say, 70% want this. You know what amazed me? Is not that 70% wanted this, is that 30% wanted that. I was astounded at how beloved the pure crap was. Right? The stuff with the dumpster in front, the 3-car garage, the slummy look of the driveways. And I've never forgotten that fully 30 to 60% of America are comfortable in extreme mediocrity. And if you cut across that, you will lose. They will resent you horribly. And by the way, the Tea Party is partially people like that who are comfortable with a certain level of whatever, and they don't want to be imposed on by moralists. So at least the smart code, if you read the smart code properly, there's a triage. And always, always, there's a way out. There's a way out. You can, yes, there is some suburban sprawl. And there's a lot of technology that says, and this is very important, I think, politically, is to say there will be a place for that too. In fact, the problem is that the playing field isn't level, that actually the 50 to 60 to 70% of the people who want to live in walkable mixed-use communities can't do it. It's all uphill. The market isn't operating. We have to operate. We have to level the playing field. And by the way, if the new urbanism ever leveled the playing field, if it were as easy to get a permit for a mixed-use, diverse community, walkable community, as it were to get suburban sprawl, the win would be extraordinary. We'd have 60 to 70% of the market on our side. They want this stuff. What's preventing it is that it takes a very special kind of developer and a very special type of commitment to actually build this stuff. So I would say that our agenda is actually to level the playing field, not to impose, not to make it mandatory, but actually to make it possible and not more difficult. That's all. And then the win would be enormous. There wouldn't be 6% new urbanism. There wouldn't be the 7% Emily said about. There'd be 60 or 70% eventually, and that would be the win. But it's very important not to prevent people who want 3-car garages from having 3-car garages. That's somebody else's job, but I would say it's not a new urbanist job. It's too counterproductive. We have made too many enemies by being absolutists. Okay, now, what we do is actually relatively easy. Do you realize that in suburbia, statistically, suburbia is mixed use? There are enough houses, jobs, shopping, and schools out there. And if you don't think there are, you have old statistics. The office parks are out there. The housing of different types are out there. There are now rental units out in the suburbs. There are now houses. There are mansions. There's everything out there. The problem is that it's not assembled properly. So the idea that we have to get jobs to move out to where the people are, or we have to get more affordable housing out to where the mansions are, that's not our problem anymore. Suburbia, the American market intelligence, because people are diverse, actually it's all out there. The problem is that it's not assembled. The omelet is never made. There's a famous drawing by Leo Creer who says, on Monday you eat the eggs, on Tuesday you eat the green peppers, on Wednesday you eat the salt. Right? Because it's all sitting out there on the kitchen table, but it's never assembled. In suburbia, we have the houses, we have the shops that directly respond to the houses. And we have the roads that lead, but nothing is ever assembled the way it is here. So you realize, in some ways, how easy it is what we do. We don't have to persuade people to go out. We just have to assemble what's landing there anyway. And the best way to do that is by actually codes. It was a shock to me when I went to architecture school, and I was actually taught to be creative and do whatever I wanted within certain very few limits. And the first building I did, somebody handed me a code book, and I said, what? I mean, nobody had ever told me there were codes. And not only codes about, I knew there were fire codes and that kind of, that kind of stuff. Yes, I didn't want to read them, but I knew they were there. But I didn't know there were codes that shaped my buildings. I was mortified. And then as we built a practice on interpreting these codes, with Arquitectónica, I realized that the power lay there. That the power was not in persuading people and educating them, but actually was controlling the radio stations that they listened to, right? It wasn't just the direct contact, let me convince you, but actually let me write the code that forces people to behave a certain way. And so that was a transcendental contribution of the new urbanism, actually the interest in codes. People had not been interested in codes for a very long time. And in fact, one of the real achievements of the new urbanism has been to make writing codes glamorous. I mean, if you can believe that, we can do anything. Writing codes, a glamorous profession, the form-based codes, And actually, writing codes is a particular thing I love. It is the most purely intellectual of all endeavors. Writing codes is actually, it's absolutely intellectual. It's actually, you're projecting a world, in the purest sense, and without any language to persuade, it's shall. You shall meet the sidewalk, in a pedestrian way. You shall make a parking space 7 feet wide. And all the fat of persuasion goes away. It's really remarkable, the American Code. And what we realized is that there were 27,000 planning departments ready to administer codes. So instead of one at a time forming the schools, it was 27,000 people who actually were not committed necessarily to their codes. Many of them knew their codes were garbage. They're internally inconsistent. Everything that came out was disappointing. It created NIMBYism because, you know, the code meant nothing. Everything was thrown to council. So it's not like the 27,000 planners. By the way, planning is a relatively idealistic profession. You know, it's not like architects or engineers who are different kinds of maniacs. Planners are the best of people. They want to really, they're committed. So they have no reason to want to administer complete crap. The planners don't resist. So what they don't want is to be given discretion. They don't want to say, well, you know, suspend the code, do this. No, no, please, please, I want job security, change my code. Don't, you know, and so the idea of actually changing code instead of getting a series of variances and exceptions is one of the fundamental platforms of the new urbanism, to change the code. And by the way, the best codes don't forbid this, they allow that. That's all. They don't forbid this, they allow that. And as I said, the market will operate and create this. Next. And this is, and we have lots of evidence from old towns. This is Coral Gables, where I live. All the red stuff is fully mixed use, civic, schools, everything. Single-family houses, all in very close proximity. It's a confetti. And this, of course, is a permit for a single PUD, in which all of this is a monoculture of houses, all of this is a monoculture of shopping, all of this is a monoculture of office park, et cetera, all separated and connected by a single collector, which is where all the congestion is. There's a huge amount of asphalt being built by the private sector in the suburbs, but none of it connects. It just gives access to the lots. So the huge investment that is being made by developers, and it's very expensive to build these big roads, are not operating to mitigate the traffic they're actually creating. Because unless you have an open grid, those roads are not mitigating it. They're just simply accessing, because again, all the traffic hits the collector. So that's why we've never spent more on infrastructure, private and public, and the congestion goes up and up and up. It isn't just that everything is more separated. It's not just that there are more automobiles. It's just that the infrastructure we're building does not network properly. You know, when you have two ways to get places, the traffic drops in half. You have 600 cars, or you have two ways with 300 each. It is one of the great miracles. It's a quasi-biblical miracle that you can actually open a road and cut the traffic in half. And by the way, if you have an open network, you don't even have to think about it. It's just human intelligence makes constant decisions and readjusts the trajectory of the day to basically stabilize it. Unfortunately, it puts a profession out of business, which is called the traffic engineering profession, because they no longer needs to be a centralized discussion. So here's an excellent example of where the environmentalists don't get it. The environmentalists privilege the retention of streams and the adjacent riparian corridor absolutely. When you have a stream, you can't cross it, right? And if you cross it very reluctantly, you get to cross it very seldom and very expensively. You know, every half mile you cross it. What happens when you clip the grid that way is that the traffic congests on either side of the clipped grid, and the density has to drop drastically. You see? Manhattan has over 2,000 streams in pipes. The fact that they're in pipes allows the grid to be comprehensively connected, which allows the density to be 200 and 300 units per acre. If a plan of Manhattan were done with current laws that actually forced every stream to be held, there would be one connecting street, Broadway, which runs on the ridge. Nothing else would essentially connect, and the density might drop to a 10th, a 20th, God knows 100. And what would happen is all these people, yes, the streams would be open, but there would be streams impacted for 100 miles out as that population were actually spread everywhere. Okay? We're now, with Paul Crabtree, we're doing a test case of Charleston. We found the original archaeology or hydrology of Charleston, and we've designed a Charleston that met current hydrological needs, stay out of the streams. And we're actually calculating what the density controlled by the single street that connected would be like as opposed to the full system of Charleston. And of course, what it would do is cover the region. And that is what I mean. When I speak about environmentalists coming in and actually administering the city in a conditional surrender, we have to say, you have to understand that actually the stream in a pipe in this area is compensated for by the density that you can increase. You see, and so then nature can be preserved elsewhere. By the way, this is I don't know whether you get what I'm saying, but there is a huge resistance to this proposition. There is a theology that says that water, surface water, must always be retained, must always be secured with cleansing riparian corridors, and must actually be crossed as little as possible. And that will create suburban sprawl. And until we, the new urbanists, concentrate on that and are able to actually have these environmentalists actually understand that we're part of the same team, that there are two tools, nature and culture, you know, wilderness and urbanism, and that both tools have to work together, not only will they continue to fail, because they're always in the defensive, but we will continue to fail, we will both continue to fail, and we will be enemies. Because right now, when an environmentalist clips one of my roads, he's the enemy of urbanism. And I'm the enemy of environmentalism. And we're just right there in the meeting up against each other. And until we understand that, by the way, the new urbanists understand that. Every new urbanist in this room understands that. This is the only room where that's understood in America. It's not understood anywhere else because it's too, you know, and we can say all we want, we can be extremely pleasant to each other, we're on the same side, blah, 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 but we ain't on the same side, technically. We're actually at each other's throats, technically, at this moment. And this is a very difficult discussion to have outside of a room like this, and you can see why, because it's two theologies fighting. Okay, next. The models. One of the things the new urbanists, this is Alexandria, this is Virginia Beach, and they're both logical. You see this number of lanes and this amount of parking and the absence of trees? This isn't madness. This is the logic of this system. When you separate everything from everything else, you do need this many lanes. You do need this much parking. But not too far away is this city, with much higher real estate value, and what we have done is instead of looking back at the models of the last 40 years, we've looked back at any model that makes sense. We are non-ideological about where we get our ideas, while actually the so-called very, very pragmatic people of the ULI, the real people, not the idealistic new urbanists, they're actually highly curtailed. They will only look at the immediate past success, right? Okay, how do you retire in America? The villages. Why? Because they sell 4,600 units a year, right? They don't look at Paris, or they don't look at the villages of France that are just as full of retirement people, where we might get other ideas. They only look at the immediate part success. And by the way, they've trained the bankers and the people who give the loans to only recognize the immediate past successes. And so we have a profession, an internal profession of, in the new urbanism, which was actually pioneered by Todd Zimmerman and Laurie Volk, and they are the people who have actually done true market analysis and not just a rear view mirror of what succeeded last. And they have been absolutely instrumental in project after project after project. They and now their disciples come in and explain to the developers that no, you don't have to do exactly what the last project did. You can actually look at the future, or you can look at the distant past. And half our work could never have gone ahead if there hadn't been that kind of study done, you know, market analysis. It's a different kind of market analysis. And that's part of the kind of people that have been actually generated by the new urbanism. So this actually becomes a model. We speak about Alexandria as if you could still build it. and not just the shopping center, which is what the ULI, well, the ULI is now here. By the way, we don't need a magazine. The New Urbanism doesn't. It's called Urban Land. We say, can we have a magazine? Why? The ULI magazine is now basically a New Urbanist magazine, and that's a tremendous success. By the way, if we say this, they'll probably not admit it. Next. And from the ground, everything about this horror, everything about this is not only legal, but actually to the last detail by code, including the kind of paint, and everything about this is illegal. Everything. This is Sonoma. It's right in front of you, and people will open a book. When I come in and I say, I really want to back out onto a collector. I want a short setback. I want mixed use. I want a 3-foot setback. Blah, blah, everything that's here. Okay, everything that's here, they'll say you can't do that. And they'll open the book and say, because it says here. And then they say, we are theoretical. And I say, no, you're theoretical. You're the people of the book. We, the New Urbanists, are the people of empirical analysis. And so I always reverse it. I said, let's go out and look, because those books are very impressive when they open them, but the books are not. And one of the things that's happened, more and more and more of the technical books are being written by New Urbanists, including the new one on context-based designs. Actually, it's interesting. The traffic engineers are the ones that resisted the most, but once they understood, they flipped the fastest. They're the ones that actually switched the fastest, because they're not ideological. If it works, prove it to us, we'll switch it. The ones that are most resistant are actually the architects, because they are ideological. They're the ones, the architecture schools who say, well, there's a problem here. There's a problem here because it looks old. I said, yeah, well, fine. And I would say that the sooner we disconnect from the architecture schools, the better. And I think the next stage of the New Urbanism is actually making the schools that actually teach empirical reality, that actually have people see what it is that works and what it is that doesn't. Next. By the way, this is called, at Harvard there was a time, go back, at Harvard there was a time when that shopping center was called unprecedented typologies. Like, whoa, wow, these things haven't been seen by the world before. We have an aesthetic problem in our hands. How do we put lace work on a big box to make it actually acceptable? I'm not kidding. Next. Okay, now the power of design. Why do we code to the level of detail? Why do we care? Why is it that our codes actually go into a level of detail that's unusual? Because it matters terribly. This is a corner store in Alexandria, much beloved by the neighbors, right? It would be a dreadful thing if it closed. People gather there, it's considered useful. This, which, by the way, I very carefully chose the same horrible colors for both. Okay, got it? Because I don't want to be unfair like Tony Nelson was. This sells the same thing as that, which is the stuff that you need between the big runs to the supermarket. This raises real estate value. This drops real estate value. To be adjacent, this has the power to lower real estate value of a small nuclear plant. Okay? You have to have a setback, you have to have a berm, the first few houses on the street are worth nothing, right? It sterilizes real estate value. And yet functionally it's the same, it sells the same thing. So when people kind of stupidly come up and say, they turned down my corner store, how can they turn down my corner store when they need the corner store? That's because they're imagining this. Okay, and it is a rational decision. They don't want this. This lowers real estate value, which is why the New Urbanists are so design intensive and rendering intensive. This whole idea, you're making pretty pictures, you can't be serious. You guys are making pretty pictures. You're not grown-ups. Pretty pictures are propaganda. I have no illusions. I spend a lot of money on renderings, and I have no illusion that they're art pieces. I have no illusion. I don't do them for my ex-professors to be proud of me. I don't do them to get prizes. They are pure propaganda posters. Okay, what they do is they get me what I want, which is to say, oh, if this is what you're talking about, bring it on. Okay, because if you don't present beautiful renderings like this, this is what they're imagining, and it's a rational decision. Almost always, when there's somebody against you, they have something in mind which is rational. And you have to bore and see what is it that is causing, you know, this in your head, and then you go after it. You have to bore and say, what is it? What experience have you had? Why is it that you don't want to shop? Why is it that you want mixed use? And then you have to clean it out, or they won't let you do it. And renderings are a tremendous tool. Next. And then, of course, the power of design is extraordinary at the level of urban design. So this is in Florida. This is, by the way, I'm giving you numbers that are like 20 years ago. Okay? Everything here sells for about $200,000. Everything here sells for about $400,000. And everything in these quadruplexes sells for about $100,000. There's micro segregation by income, right? And by the way, this is a pecking order in which the next one down is the inner city. And boy, you don't want that, right? Because there's no distinction between the inner city that burnt down in 1959 and somebody that has a house that's $100,000 less. You know, that whole sickness, that illness comes, an infection comes all the way up. In fact, I have a newspaper article that says, subdivision panics. And then you read about it, is somebody's actually building a house that's a $250,000 house in their subdivision. Panics. Okay, as if $250,000 were actually a little HUD apartment somewhere. They cannot, but that's what's built in, and you have to deal with it. So how do we do it? By the way, okay, so my father was a developer, and he had no illusions. He was taught that the greatest human motivation for buying real estate is snobism. People pay a lot for snobism. Okay, there are others, like affordability and proximity, but snobism is very high. So there's an element of snobism that's beyond fear. How do they handle it in America? Okay, this is a famous block in Georgetown that has one of the great expensive streets in America here with mansions facing each other. These are townhouses, which are less expensive, facing each other, and then apartment buildings, which are much less expensive, facing each other, right? So they share the same piece of real estate, right? They're all backed into each other, but the fact is that they have different addresses. So you can actually administer the snobism, which seems to be in human nature, and actually mixed income, if you know about fronts and backs and fronts and backs. In suburbia, this is impossible, because in suburbia, the thoroughfare is actually asymmetrical. The zoning is cut on the thoroughfare, and this is one zoning and that's another. In new urbanism, the zoning is cut down the middle of the block. You see, so people have less expensive, more expensive. And if you look at the aerial photography, which now is so cheap, so inexpensive now with Google, you can actually see very nice subdivisions, and then you can see that the main street is on the same block, but they face different ways. What you face is very, very powerful, and we use that to do mixed use. The other thing we do, of course, is an architecture which is actually compatible. What happens when you don't meet people, by the way, in Florida, people live in socioeconomic archipelagos. When you get in a car, you go to a different shop, and you go to a different club, and you go to a different market. And other people who live in the same geography go to a less expensive club, less expensive school, less expensive market. You're in the same geography, but the car actually permits the segregation, because you don't actually have to meet. So geography means nothing when you have cars. And this is what happens here. These people don't go to the same shops as these people. And when you don't know what people are like, you fear them. Oh my God, they go to the dollar store. Geez, what must that be like? They must be mentally deficient. Or have you seen what people look like in Walmart? Like, why would you want to share a parking lot with them, right? And there's all this stuff. Well, what happens when you walk around here is you actually meet the school teacher that you trust your children to. You meet your own child. You actually realize that the people that you're living with is yourself, because you meet them as humans. And people of extraordinarily different socioeconomic classes are actually, if you put them around the table, not that different at all. It's the car that permits it, psychological segregation. So it's very important. These are tiny things that make better and worse new urbanism. There's an awful lot of bad new urbanism that doesn't understand this. You see it in the plans. You see the plans are done with the grids and everything, and the zoning's in the wrong place. Now this brings something up. New urbanism is relatively easy. It's not rocket science, but it isn't nothing. You can't just walk out and say, I'm a new urbanist now. what my father used to say, all you need is to buy a cigar. No, actually, you have to know a few things. And a few of those things are now in books that are relatively easy to read. So while at the same time you can all be new urbanists relatively quickly, it isn't nothing. You do have to do some studying, and the books are available. Next. And of course, this propensity to spin and wiggle in the futile pursuit of a picturesque effect prevents the front and back discipline from happening. But this actually looks so exciting, and this looks so dull. This is Kentlands, one of our projects where mansions meet mansions, houses meet houses, and actually townhouses meet townhouses, and everybody's all mixed up. No problem. And this is the kind of the preferred wiggle, you know, the picturesque wiggle, which actually prevents the front and back from happening. By the way, not to speak of radical disorientation. How do you find anything or any address? Next. Next. And this is very important. One of the reasons that we control architecture is not that we have, despite what the schools say, the architecture schools, we do not have fascist tendencies. For me, style is camouflage. I am style neutral. I don't care whether it's modernist or federal or brick or, you know, Louisiana. I don't care, as long as I can control a very narrow range of architectural expression, because it permits me mixed use. When buildings look alike on the surface, they're much more acceptable. Like, for example, in Kentlands, you know, 25 years ago, this sold for $450,000, this townhouse sold for $170,000, and this rented for $500 a month. And people would literally stand here. Developers would come and say, I heard about this corner. How did you do it? How did you do it? How did you do it? And we said two things. First of all, we didn't talk about it all the time, you know, trying to say you're all different. But second of all, it's exactly the same brick, the same roof pitch, and the same windows. It's just one smaller, one isn't. Okay, so you don't make a big deal about it, but the camouflage. We have done modernist towns, as long as they're all modernist. Because if they're not, then, you know, oh, it's different. One of the things that people have against high-rises, if you look at a place like Tampa, you will see houses immediately adjacent to 10-story buildings. No problem. I mean, immediately adjacent to the best neighborhood, Mediterranean house, Mediterranean high-rise, no problem. Somebody builds a high-rise just down the street, which is 6 stories, and it's got an egg crate of balconies. You know, it's a different expression. It's a political crisis of absolutely enormous proportions. And I've walked around with people and say, how come that's a problem, but what about this one? It says, oh, no, my mother lives there, that's fine. I said, but sir, that's 8 stories, and you're complaining about 6 stories. And they say, no, but that one's all right. What's the difference? The difference is, 5 minutes, the difference is the style. What's extraordinary about architectural style is the architects are correct, absolutely correct. It's of extraordinary power, but it's not what they think. It's not the power of self-expression. It's not the power of expressing our current culture. It's actually the power of camouflage. Okay, and anybody who knows that when you have adversaries, camouflage is what you want. Nature knows that, okay? You don't always need peacocks, okay? And for me, style is camouflage, and you can imagine how popular I am in those places where actually the style of architecture is, in fact, the existence of the architect. It's the projection of the personality of the architect. It couldn't be more hostile. I actually feel that we have an irreconcilable relationship with the Architectural Academy, because it's not like we can come together. It's just that we have a completely different basis for caring about the same thing, and they're completely contradictory. I want this actually to be camouflage, and they want it to be feathers. You know, I want toads, and they want peacocks. It's completely different. Next. And the other thing is, and here you see it in action, you know, a very small house, beloved neighbor of some very large houses. These are only 12 feet wide. And of course, you know, there are things that are now, by the way, there are many, many things that are now the air we breathe. I can't tell you how many. The outbuilding, the granny flat, the alley, the lot. The lot. When we started practicing, the lot didn't exist. Everything was a PUD. I can't tell you how many things, the street, the walkable street, how many things that are now the air we breathe, not our inventions, but were restored by the new urbanism. I mean, the granny flat was one of the most, we used to lecture in the first CNUs about the granny flat, and it was like, oh my God, it's the nuke in a tube. Ooh, this really solves it. It's over, the problem is over. We can now have affordable housing. Next. And then, of course, we have the models of a mixed use and what it's like. The way we present, by the way, is what's it like to have lunch when you're in a place like this, and what's it like to have lunch when you're in a place like this. Just what's it like when you have an hour off for lunch? How much you spend walking, how many restaurants are available, you know, how much free time do you have, how do you spend it? And we project this to the people. It's really, what's it like for you? And this is what our political presentations are about. They're not about theory. They're all about what is that person doing and what's that person doing in that 1 hour for lunch. And then instead of speaking for standard of living, oh my God, but this is a newer office building and this is like 80 years old, right? Standard, by the way, by modern standards of assessment, this is a Class C office building and this is a Class B. That's the American system of measuring standard of living. How new is the building? How much parking does it have? How many cars do you have? How many miles of road do you have per capita? Even how many trees do you have? That's standard of living. We're beginning now to measure quality of life, which is a different measure, and it really has to do with how do you spend your day? In other words, how much free time do you have? How much discretionary income do you have left because you haven't spent it all on buying cars and things? And how do you spend your day? And the gradual trend, which is, by the way, what they measure in Europe, the reason we don't understand the French, and we think they're absolutely a civilization taking a dive, when in fact when you go there you say, what are the Americans talking about? Is that we're measuring completely different things. You know, by American standards, they're the biggest losers in Europe. They're absolutely on the way out. All the stats are terrible. And then you show up, it's exactly the opposite. You can barely tolerate coming back. It is actually, you land at an airport in America and it's the first humiliation begins there. And it never ends, like from the taxi to the luggage, all the way home. It's just a series of humiliations, you know? And yeah, I got my own car, I got my own big house, but it's not what we're measuring different things. And the new urbanism and the way we present is always quality of life. How do you spend your day? And, you know, how are you forced to spend your money as opposed to actually having the discretion? Next. And mixed use through devices like alleys in the back. By the way, industry no longer pollutes. There's no reason to segregate it. It's only the trucks that are a problem, so accommodate the trucks. You know, many of the laws of segregation, even of industry, are out of date. You know, we don't create smoke and stink and bad water. We've exported that to the third world. The Asians are putting up with it. We no longer even develop a photograph. You know, you can't. You're not allowed to. Too many chemicals. So what happens is, but we do still have the trucks. You put them in the back. Like this is a wonderful street in Leesburg, Virginia, and this is a big printing plant, and the trucks are in the back. Next. And of course, successional urbanism. New urbanists made a mistake at the end of the last century. We actually began to project the climax condition. We began to project the 4-story mixed-use building right from the beginning, which you can only do with terrific affluence, you know? A 100-foot building, mixed-use 4 stories, is about $15 million. And you're gonna wait for a $15 million town, you know, to have 100 feet of town center, you have to wait many, many years. Generations will grow and move away before you have your town center. But at the beginning, the early new urbanism, we began with successional urbanism, with inexpensive buildings. There was the inaugural condition, and then the subsequent condition, and then the climax condition. We used to do that. And now the next generation is restoring that. You know, the lean urbanism is about successional urbanism. We need the shops right from the beginning, but they're not the final condition. And that's a whole new thing that's electrifying the old folk of the new urbanism, is that the young people actually want to do smaller projects and they want to get going fast. Next, which is a great American tradition. The definition of open space, instead of just in terms of quantity, There's a lot of open space in suburbia, none of which is useful, as opposed to speaking typologically of squares. So instead of presenting, we want 40% or 60% open space, you say it's not about quantity, we want a square. And thanks to people like Jan Gehl and people like William White, we read the sociology. We know how spaces work. This is not a mystery anymore. This whole idea that we must actually, or like, like for example, well, I mean, I can speak ill of a great number of professionals who mystify the making of public space as used by professionals. We know how to do it. The critique began in the 60s. As soon as public space began to fail, people started doing the job as to why they failed. What we need to do is read the books. Read William White, read Jan Gehl, it's right there. There's no reason for public space ever to fail. There's 5 rules that make this succeed and this fail. We know it. Stop experimenting. Part of the problem is that it's so easy, you can't actually charge for this. You have to go through the public for project spaces, 3 years of nudging chairs around until you get it right. No, I'm sorry, we know exactly how you do it. It's virtually the same way every time. And we must read. Jan Gehl was going to come, and unfortunately he got a bigger prize that was actually closer to his home, and he's 80 years old. But his books are there. We just need to read that. Next. By the way, as far as I can know, we're the only designers that actually read the sociology. The new urbanists actually read about, what makes a place actually be safe. The Oscar Newman's work. It's astounding how few designers, particularly architects, know this stuff. It's always experimenting and starting from the beginning. And generally, while I think it's perfectly fine to experiment and fail at the level of the building, particularly the small building, you must take risks. It is too cruel and absolutely irresponsible to fail at the level of urbanism. You're affecting too many people for too many years to experiment at all. You must be very, very conservative about how you design your public space. Even if it's not that interesting what comes out, it's too much of a risk to actually fail yet again. What does that say? 0. Okay. So actually, this is a very good point. At this point, there's a cut. I've just spoken about housing and office parks and open space, et cetera. I sort of marched through the big things. At this point, what begins is a series of analyses at a different scale about how it is that you actually get people to walk and to interact, and how you get shops to work. Okay? It's very old stuff. By now, everything that I was about to say is either in 100 videotapes that you can find, exactly like this one, or it is in books. There are, for example, the design of public space has been blended very cleverly by people like Bob Gibbs, who are retail consultants. And the retailers, they can't afford to get public space wrong, because they don't die. It doesn't take them a generation of bad urbanism to die. The shops close within a year. Okay? The punishment for getting public space wrong is brutal when it comes to retail. And so the retailers, the bad people who do the shopping malls, have been sometimes our best advisors. They tell us what the widths are, what the pavements are, what kind of glass to use. They've been very, very good. And it's making, the new urbanism is very comfortable to people that actually go to other kinds of conferences. So Bob Gibbs both comes here and teaches us how to design. By the way, all of these people that I mentioned have books. There's a book on retail by Bob Gibbs. He also teaches at Harvard at the moment. At tremendously greater cost, by the way, than at CNU, if you want to know. But he actually has a book, and he actually doesn't let us get it wrong anymore. And so, it's a mature organization. It's much, in some ways, less exciting than it used to be when we were actually, trying to figure things out. But now it's much more oriented towards experts, towards expertise. So if you're new at this, I think you will find, in some ways, you will probably thinking already, I know that already, okay? And I think what you'll find is that you know it or you're sympathetic to it, but some good reading will get you very far along, and then you can be a new urbanist without great difficulty. Okay, so thank you.